Hey, and welcome to the Dressolation Diaries. Doing something a little different today. I woke up a little blue at not being able to get to my family and have hugs. I know a lot of you are probably going through the same kind of thing. As a very famous person once said, alone. Yes, that's the key word. The most awful word in the English tongue. Murder doesn't hold a candle to it, and hell is only a poor synonym. Yep, Stephen King said that. And Stephen King has gotten me through a lot in my life, times of lowness and aloneness, and even my insomnia when I discovered the book Insomnia. And insomnia really speaks to me in lots of different ways, and I take different things from it every time I read it, depending on my mood, depending on what's happening in my life. And I guess I wanted to share a couple of the passages out of it with you. I hope that I'm allowed to do this. I hope I don't get in trouble for doing this. I have no idea. And I know I like being read to aloud, so I thought I would do that. And I'm going to start with one of the pieces of the front of this book. It's actually part 1, chapter 1. Part 1 starts with a quote. "There is a gulf fixed between those who can sleep and those who cannot. It is one of the great divisions of the human race." By Iris Murdoch in Nuns and Soldiers. So chapter 1. About a month after the death of his wife, Ralph Roberts began to suffer from insomnia for the first time in his life. The problem was mild to begin with, but it grew steadily worse. 6 months after the first interruptions in his heretofore unremarkable sleep cycle, Ralph had reached a state of misery he could hardly credit, let alone accept. Towards the end of the summer of 1993, he began to wonder what it would be like to spend his remaining years on Earth in a starry-eyed daze of wakefulness. Of course it wouldn't come to that, he told himself. It never does. But was that true? He didn't really know. That was the devil of it, and the books on the subject that Mike Hanlon had steered him down to at the Derry Public Library weren't much help. There were several on sleep disorders, but they seemed to contradict one another. Some called insomnia a symptom, others called it a disease, and at least one called it a myth. The problem went further than that. However, so as far as Ralph could tell from the books, no one seemed exactly sure what sleep itself was, how it worked, or what it did. He knew he should quit playing amateur researcher and go to the doctor, but he found that surprisingly hard to do. He supposed he still bore Dr. Litchfield a grudge. It was Litchfield, after all, who had originally diagnosed Carolyn's brain tumour as tension headaches. Except Ralph had an idea that Litchfield, a lifelong bachelor, might have actually believed that Carolyn was suffering from nothing but a moderate case of the vapours. And Litchfield, who had once made himself as scarce as medically possible once Caroline was diagnosed. Ralph was positive, if he had asked the man about that point blank, Litchfield would have said he had handled the case off to Jamal, the specialist, all quite proper and above board. Yes. Except Ralph had made it his business to get a good look into Litchfield's eyes on the few occasions he had seen him between Carolyn's first convulsions last July and her death this March. And Ralph thought that what he'd seen in those eyes was a mixture of unease and guilt. It was the look of a man trying very hard to forget he is fucked up. Ralph believed the only reason he could still look at Litchfield without wanting to knock his block off was that Dr. Jamal had told him that an earlier diagnosis probably would have made no difference. By the time Caroline's headaches had started, the tumour was already well entrenched, and no doubt sending out little bursts of bad cells to other areas of the brain like malignant care packages. In late April, Dr. Jamal had left to establish a practice in southern Connecticut, and Ralph missed him. He thought he could have talked to him about his sleeplessness, and he had an idea that Jamal would have listened in a way that Litchfield wouldn't, or couldn't. By late summer, Ralph had read enough about insomnia to know the type with which he was afflicted. While not rare, was a lot less common than the usual slow sleep insomnia. People unaffected by insomnia are usually in first stage sleep 7 to 20 minutes after turning in. Slow sleepers, on the other hand, sometimes take as long as 3 hours to slip below the surface. And while normal sleepers begin to ramp down into third stage sleep, what some of the old books called theta sleep, Ralph had discovered, 45 minutes or so after drifting off, slow sleepers usually took an additional hour or two to get down there. And on many nights, they did not get down that way at all. They woke unrefreshed, sometimes with unfocused memories of unpleasant, tangled dreams, and more often with the mistaken impression that they had been awake all night. Following Caroline's death, Ralph began to suffer from premature waking. He continued to go to bed most nights following the conclusion of the 11 o'clock news, and he continued to pop off to sleep almost at once. But instead of waking promptly at 6:55, 5 minutes before the clock radio alarm buzzed, he began to wake at 6. At first he dismissed this as no more than the price of living with a slightly enlarged prostate and a 70-year-old set of kidneys. But he never seemed to have to go that badly when he woke up, and he found it impossible to get back to sleep even after he'd emptied what he had accumulated. He simply lay in bed, the bed he'd shared with Caroline for so many years, waiting for it to be 5 of 7, or 1:45 anyway, so he could get up again. Eventually he gave up even trying to drop off. He'd simply lay there with his long-fingered, slightly swollen hands laced together on his chest and stared up at the shadowy ceiling with eyes that felt as big as doorknobs. Sometimes he thought of Dr. Jamal down there in Westport, talking in his soft and comforting Indian accent, building up his little piece of the American dream. Sometimes he thought of the places that he and Caroline had gone in the old days, and the one he kept coming back to was a hot afternoon at Sand Beach in Bar Harbor. The two of them sitting at a picnic table in their bathing suits, sitting under a big bright umbrella, eating sweet fried clams and drinking bud from long-necked bottles as they watched the sailboats scudding across the dark blue ocean. When had that been? 1964? 1967? Did it even matter? Probably not. The alterations in his sleep schedule wouldn't have mattered either if they'd just ended there. Ralph would have adapted to the changes, not just with ease, but with gratitude. All the books he hunted through that summer seemed to confirm one bit of folk wisdom he'd heard all of his life. People slept less as they got older. If losing an hour or two a night was the only fee he had to pay for the dubious pleasure of being 70 years young, he would pay it gladly and consider himself well off. But it didn't end there. By the first week of May, Ralph was waking up to birdsong at 5:15 a.m. He tried earplugs for a few nights, though he doubted from the outset that they would work. It wasn't the newly returned birds that were waking him up, nor the occasional delivery truck backfire out on Harris Avenue. He had always been the sort of guy who could sleep in the middle of a brass marching band, and he didn't think that had changed. What had changed was inside his head. There was a switch in there. Something was turning it on a little earlier every day, and Ralph hadn't the slightest idea of how to keep it from happening. By June, he was popping out of sleep like Jack in his box at 4:30 a.m., 4:45 at the latest. And by the middle of July, no, not quite as hot as July of 92, but bad enough, thanks very much, he was snapping to at around 4 o'clock. It was during those long, hot nights, taking up too little of the bed, where he and Caroline had made love on so many hot nights, and cold ones, that he began to consider what a hell his life would become if sleep departed entirely. In daylight, he was still able to scoff at the notion, but he was discovering certain dismal truths about F. Scott Fitzgerald's Dark Night of the Soul, and the grand prize winner was this: at 4:15 a.m., anything seems possible. Anything. During the days, he was able to go telling himself that he was simply experiencing a readjustment of his sleep cycle, that his body was responding in perfectly normal fashion to a number of big changes in his life, retirement and the loss of his wife being the two biggest. He sometimes used the word loneliness when he thought about his new life, but he shied away from the dreaded D word, stuffing it back into the deep closet of his subconscious whenever it happened to glimmer for a moment in his thoughts. Loneliness was okay. Depression, most certainly, was not. That was chapter 1. And a lot of that, for me, and my insomnia, it's what my life felt like. Very much. And actually, I discovered even the words slow to sleep, insomnia, in this book. And it convinced me to go to a doctor about it. Because I cried when I realized that's exactly how I felt. So, yeah. And then, I don't know. A few years later, I was divorced. And I read Insomnia again. And there was another passage that spoke to me hard and made me cry and think about it for a while. And I'm going to share that with you too, because those are both why, weirdly, I love this book as well as the rest of the story. But there's something about how Stephen King puts the ordinary in words that makes it touching. So, yeah, I'm just going to start. It's a short bit, don't worry. I'm going to start sort of in the middle of a chapter as well, so bear with me. He slid the letter carefully back into its envelope, trying to remember how long Ed and Helen had been married. 6 or 7 years, he thought. Caroline would have known for sure. How much courage does it take to fire up your tractor and plough under a crop you spent 6 or 7 years growing? He asked himself. How much courage to go on and do that after you've spent all that time finding out how to prepare the soil and when to plant and how much water and when to reap? How much to just say, I have to quit these peas. Peas are no good for me. I better try corn or beans. A lot, he said, wiping at the corners of his eyes again. A damn lot. That's what I think. So that's me. Dressolation Diaries. Feeling a little blue, but going back to a favourite. Ralph, the hero that we didn't ask for, but we need. So, I encourage you to read it. Insomnia. It's a really good book. Thanks for stopping by.